let's see, is the mic working? Okay, that's good. I'm going to go ahead and pray, and then I'll get started. I'm a little earlier, but we have a lot to get to, and, well, you'll see. Lord, we just thank you so much, and just help me to speak truthfully and clearly about this topic today, and I hope that we become inspired to view and to take seriously worship, and that if we have any atheist neighbors or friends, that we would be able to speak boldly to them in love and with reverence to you. And so we just pray for those atheist friends that are within our community's midst, and we also pray for evangelism across this nation. And Lord, just help prepare our hearts today for worship. And God, you are so worthy of our worship. Thank you so much for this day. In Christ's name I pray. Amen. All right. Today is going to be a little ambitious. We've kind of like last time with Mormonism, we went through doctrines and then we went through the history of doctrines. And it's kind of been an introductory overview. But for atheism, I'm going to make an argument. And I'm going to build it throughout the lecture. And I'm going to try to argue that atheism is a religion. And you'll kind of see as it goes along, but you'll discover it as it goes along. That's what I'll say. But I want to begin with the atheism I think we are normally interacting with, or we normally conceive of. And this is a picture of the four horsemen. I don't know, back in the day in the early 2000s, I remember I was like watching YouTube debates and stuff like that, and these guys were just popular because like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, they would debate William Lane Craig, and then they were on YouTube, and they posted this conversation which all four are talking about atheism and the critique of religion. And these guys wrote these publications during the cultural atmosphere of 9/11, where religion and politics were kind of really heavily discussed. And with those publications, it respurned a sort of popular reaction to atheism. And it also was something that was very outspoken. It was very media-driven. I think Richard Dawkins in The God Delusion said that he wanted to make atheists proud of their atheism and like kind of coming out, you know. And it was also very confrontational, in your face. You know, there would be videos on YouTube where Christopher Hitchens would be like debating a Christian or a Muslim, and then the phrase is that Hitch slaps them, you know, so you can kind of get that sense of the offensiveness and confrontational nature of it. But they have these core beliefs, so I'll go through those. One, religion should be evaluated through scientific and rational inquiry, right? So the religious claims that, let's say, Christianity makes about the virgin birth and the resurrection should be exposed to the scientific method. And then the second one follows from that. You know, when you actually look at the scientific evidence, atheism is the conclusion most consistent with scientific and rational inquiry. So that's one of the main arguments that they make as well. And then the third one, well, if the scientific inquiry points that atheism is the sort of correct conception of how you're to view the world, then scientific and rational inquiry can be a source of morality and meaning without religion, right? And you kind of demonstrate this through probably the most popular text within the New Atheist movement, with Richard Dawkins and The God Delusion. And you see these like ideas in the text. So number one, he says, an amusing, if rather pathetic case study in miracles is the great prayer experiment. Does praying for patients help them recover? So what is he trying to say? Well, he's setting up a foundation. normally the division that many atheists like Stephen Jay Gould had made was that science is empirical, and that's their magisterium, and then Christianity has to do with like salvation and happiness and all those sorts of things. And so that's their place. But Dawkins wants to make this move. He wants to say that theism is actually a scientific claim because it actually describes empirical reality. And so same thing with prayer. Prayer is sort of like, or intercessory prayer is like a causal thing. I pray to God and then I get healed. So he's really wanting to push these religious claims that they can be scientifically tested, right? Even though I don't know how you would, it's pretty dubious to me how you would be able to test that. But that's the claim. And then the second one, he says, the most ingenious and powerful claim so far discovered is Darwinian evolution by natural selection. We can now say that the illusion of design in living creatures is just that, an illusion, right? So if you take a look at biology, you take a look at the fossil record, you take a look at the geological record, even though these sort of natural phenomena appear to be designed, in actuality, these forms are actually generated by natural selection and is in a process of evolution. So that's the other claim. The basis or foundation of the critique is a scientific theory, right? And then the third one, he says the urge to kindness, right? To altruism, to generosity, to empathy, to pity. It is just like sexual desire. We can no more help ourselves feeling pity when we see a weeping unfortunate than we help ourselves feeling lust for a member of the opposite sex, right? So he's saying that here, kindness is a trait. It's a trait that us as a species and an organism exhibit, and it is something that was advantageous and then, has been repeated, as history kind of evolves and social institutions kind of become more complex and expand. But notice that he's not appealing to divine revelation. He's not appealing to divine authority. He's looking at sort of like these like simple societies and kind of coming to these conclusions, which is interesting because, of course, you could say that that there is an urge to kindness, I suppose. But when he says that it is just like sexual desire, I guess you can say that. He mentions lust, and of course, with sexual desire, there's benefits to that, right? I mean, procreation is one, but it also has aggressive impulses. You could hurt someone with your desire, and so it's interesting that you kind of have to restrain some desires and advance other desires. And the question is, like, of course, you can say the origin of those desires, but that doesn't explain which desires should I choose to act upon, right? So it's interesting. So you would have to develop a moral ethic to do that. And while this is like kind of what we're most used to, I really want to broaden your understanding of atheism, because atheism is more than just a rejection of God. I want to kind of read rather quickly this quote from Friedrich Nietzsche. It's a very famous quote. And he's talking about a madman, and he's going up to these people, and he's sort of trying to get their attention. And he says, "Where is God?" he cried. "I tell you, we have killed him. You and I, we are all his murderers. How can we console ourselves, the murderers of all murderers?" Right? The holiest and mightiest thing the world has ever possessed has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood from us? With what water could we clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement? Is the magnitude of this deed not too great for us? Do we not ourselves have to become gods merely to appear worthy of it? And this is what I want you to know. There was never a greater deed, and whoever is born after us will, on account of this deed, belong to a higher history than all history up to that point. Friedrich Nietzsche was a philosopher at the end of the 19th century, and he is famous within his works because he is trying to reevaluate the inherited morals of Western culture and is trying to kind of convert them in light of this situation, in light of the death of God. And so he wants to ask this question of what happens to human life once belief in God loses its authority. And he wants to point to this greater deed, right? What is this deed? This deed is the two parts of atheism. It's the denial of God, and then it's also the construction of meaning after those values that God, that religion had promoted have kind of gone, have kind of ceased, right? So, it is a claim that humanity is now responsible to making and creating and establishing values and such as truth, such as morality, such as human dignity, such as the meaning of suffering, such as the purpose of one's life. And so one of the other things that this sort of opens up, the death of God opens up, is the threat of nihilism, right? The threat of meaninglessness, the threat that the situation of the death of God will so absorb you and so kind of keep you down that either A, you will resort back to religious belief, or B, you'll be someone who is very hopeless. And that's not what he wants to do. He wants to overcome these things, right? He wants to open up the possibility of human values overcoming this nihilism. That nihilism is sort of a threat, and we need to overcome it with the creation of human values. And that's the tension, right? That's the two parts of atheism. It's the denial of God plus the greater deed. And Albert Camus is someone later, he writes in France during the 1950s and 60s, and he is reading Nietzsche, right? He read this, right? And he's thinking this through. And he writes in this book called The Myth of Sisyphus. He says, "Hence the intelligence, too, tells me in its way that this world is absurd. Its contrary, blind reason, may well claim that all is clear. I was waiting for proof and longing for it to be right, but despite so many pretentious centuries, I know that is false. What is absurd is the confrontation of this irrational and the wild longing for clarity, whose call echoes in the human heart," right? So what is the tension? He's noticing this, that there is a human longing for clarity, but it collides with a silent and indifferent universe. It's something that the universe is not going to justify my life. And not only that, it doesn't provide me moral examples on how to live my life. So how can I, if the absurdity is true, how can I morally live out my life? How can I live according to my morals if the world doesn't really provide you with moral values? And so the way he wants to kind of combat this tension is he says, "Thus I draw from the absurd three consequences, which are my revolt, my freedom, and my passion. By the mere activity of consciousness, I transform into a rule of life what was an invitation to death. I refuse suicide." And he begins this essay on the myth of Sisyphus with the question of suicide. Is it something that is something that, it kind of, this absurdity kind of entails? And there's two kinds. There's one that's the physical suicide, right? But there's another one. There's the philosophical suicide. It's when you look at the absurd, when you look at nihilism, you resort back to theism, right? You kind of don't, take it seriously, right? And what does he want to say? He wants to say that the decision to live is something that is fully conscious and aware of this absurdity. And his revolt is basically that he is going to continue to live and continue to live fully despite the absurd. And from this, he becomes responsible for the values that he have. He can make choices, and he's going to live out the possibility of life fully, right? So he's creating moral values from this absurdity, right? I want to try to, maybe I need to summarize this for time's sake. But this is a book by Michael J. Buckley, and I remember I was reading this week. I found this book in my shelf, and I was like, oh, wow, I finally have a reason to read this book. And it's kind of fascinating. Well, I'm happy that I found it. But let's read the first part. He says, because atheism is parasitic on theism for its name, its meaning, and its adversary, it is imperative to investigate theism, its use of God, those who constitute the theist, and so on. Because atheism suggests a dependence upon theism even for its generation and existence, it is imperative to investigate the transition in which theism gives way to atheism. So that is such a big idea, right? Because what Buckley is trying to say is that atheism is conceptually dependent on theism. If you really think about it, we remember sort of the karmic systems of Hindu and Buddhism, that there's a cycle of rebirth that's going on, right? But atheists don't generally think in karmic cycles, right? They think that when you are born, that's when you begin your life, and then when you die, that is when you end, right? So they take, let's say, the beginning part of like the theistic model, but they cut out, let's say, the final judgment. They cut out God and his creation, but they still kind of keep that sort of conceptual scheme. And then, it's something also is that atheism can't exist on its own abstractly, right? There's something in which that atheism inherently inherits theological concepts. It's something that it can't, push away theological concepts totally. And then this next passage, he says, whether it measures a remarkable advance in the revolutionary arrangements of social classes, so that's kind of like talking about Marxism, or emerges in the conversion of common interests from the transcendent to the exploration and conquest of this world, right? Atheism remains a judgment, a statement about the nature of things. What is more, it is primarily a religious judgment, whether that religion adopts the form of natural revealed religion or philosophy or humanism. As a religious judgment, atheism, this is the big point, atheism possesses its own plot, its own argument in the history of ideas, its own demands for coordinated inquiry. And he's making two claims. One is that atheism isn't just necessarily the negation of God. It's something that is a sign of transition, right? It's moving from theism, and then it's going to go into humanist philosophy, which, has its own plot. It has its own story. For instance, you could say that in terms of the idea of progress, humans had these simple religious societies, right? But these religious ideas have advanced, right? What began as polytheistic now is monotheistic. And now we're at this point in culture in which, we have kind of go beyond ideas of God. So that's a plot, right? That's a lot different than the plot, let's say, of the Bible and the story of redemption and salvation that can be played out through that. And parts of the plot of atheist religions, I think, is also an inheritance of the Christian plot. So there's a sense in which it can't escape theism. And if we agree that theism is a religion, then it really can't escape religion. Right? And we're going to kind of see that tension, right? We're going to see it expressed in a couple ways, because I think this is a good way to be able to divide, let's say, the different sort of conceptions of atheism, right? Like we said, there's a clash between us desiring meaning and the universe having no meaning. And there's kind of two ways you can parse out atheism. One is tragic. So Albert Camus kind of says that the conflict cannot really be overcome. And then there are those, and so that's a more pessimistic attitude. And the ones that we're going to go through here are more optimistic. They say that that tension is something that you can overcome, right? And so this is a quote from Corliss Lamont. He was a very famous atheist back in his day. He's kind of gone out of favor, but he's probably one of the clearest writers on atheism that I've ever seen. I mean, he's just, I'm always impressed by his writing. But in this, he's I'll paraphrase this a bit, right, for time's sake. Yeah, I'm going to paraphrase this a bit. he wants to say, he's critiquing this idea of immortality, right? And he's saying that, when we lose immortality, right, when we realize that we are mortal and that there is no hope in terms of immortality, you would think that would be a very tragic crisis. But it is not a tragic crisis. It's something that can be overcome. It can be overcome because immortality, or the idea of mortality, actually becomes liberating, right? We can kind of get rid of these religious ideas, actually look at what is true, and sort of focus our lives, right, around building a better, society. He says at the end, furthermore, to confront with simple and unfailing courage the stern fact that death means death is in itself an ethical achievement of deep significance and one that strongly sustains the moral obligation of men to seek and accept the truth wherever it may lead, right? So what is he doing? He's providing meaning. And the meaning is that overcoming a universe in which it cannot provide immortality, even though we desire immortality, but that we overcome it through, creating a sort of cooperative action by sort of reforming society and improving earthly life. It focuses more on earthly life. And with Richard Dawkins, there's also this tension. We go back to him. This is a book called Climbing Mount Improbable. And he says that evolution is an enchanted loom of shuttling DNA codes whose evanescent patterns as they dance their partners through geological deep time. There's a sort of sense in which he tries to infuse within evolution a sense of wonder. And he says that even the most difficult problems can be solved, and even the most precipitous heights can be scaled, if only a slow, gradual, step-by-step pathway can be found. Mount Improbable cannot be assaulted. Gradually, if not always slowly, it must be climbed, right? So this tension, what's the tension he's speaking of? Well, it's apparent, or it appears, that the world is designed. It's very complex. Like if you look at, let's say, a fig, and you open up inside, it's like probably one of the most complex things you've ever seen. It looks like it's designed, but that's the illusion, right? The universe is apparently, or natural selection is apparently improbable, but it provides a natural explanation. So here it's like a cause towards moral action, right? But here it's cosmological. It's trying to explain the whole universe. And that these patterns that we see in nature can be discovered by human inquiry, right? And there's also this progression in which science is something that can slowly discover truth, right? So it's something that can be overcome. And probably another great example is Karl Marx, who, again, is sort of making this claim, this tension between human productive possibilities and the class structure that prevents their fulfillment. And he critiques this sort of capitalist structure, and he wants to claim that he says they openly declare that their ends can be attained only by forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite. So there is a sense in which there is a conflict in history, right, between these historical material forces, and that there is a sort of redemption that is possible within history, right? So these sort of social forces that make us alienated can be something that can be overcome, right? So, and then the other thing is that because you've kind of demonstrated, of course it's false, you've demonstrated the process of history and that the potential for redemption is possible, it creates its own meaning, right? It creates its own ethics. It becomes something of an obligation to actually join, like, say, a communist party, right? But again, this is sort of the same point with Karl Lurith, is that it inherits a sort of Christian plot. With many of these views, it requires a resolution. It asks for universal significance. It seeks a transformation within a person, and it desires freedom. And these sort of modern philosophies of progress, these sort of secular atheist sort of ideologies, what he's trying to claim in this book is that they inherit a biblical eschatology. They inherit sort of the Christian view of let's say the fallen condition, conversion, and then redemption, right? And he wants to say that Marx has established a kingdom of God without God on earth, which is the ultimate goal and ideal of Marx's historical messianism. So again, sort of it's inheriting these inherently religious values within this atheist scheme. There is, I won't have time to get through this, right? But there is a pessimistic attitude. Maybe I do. And he wants, this man is E.M. Chirian. He's a very interesting man. He was a Romanian emigre. After World War II, he moved to Paris, and he's something of it. He has a lot of idiosyncratic. He's idiosyncratic, you know. He suffered from insomnia. He suffered from depression. He's generally probably, you know, the most pessimistic man I've ever met in my entire life in books. And he wants to do this move that, you know, the trouble is with being born. Existence itself is the problem, not death, right? He wants to say, 3 in the morning, I realize this second, then this one, then the next. I draw up the balance sheet for each minute, and why all this? Because I was born. It is a special type of sleeplessness that produces the indictment, right? And you would think, oh, wow, you know, that kind of reminds me of Buddhism. You know, one of the noble truths of Buddhism is that life is suffering. So when you get born into this suffering, right? But how deep is his pessimism? His deep pessimism is this: my faculty for disappointment surpasses understanding. It is what lets me comprehend Buddha, but also what keeps me from following him. He's rejecting completely salvation. And he wants to sort of defy the consolation, not only of religious systems, but also of these sort of secular attempts at providing meaning. He wants to say that these systems do not liberate into process, and that suffering and disappointment is built into the universe, right? So he's rejecting all these values. He's rejecting salvation. He's rejecting revelation. The universe really is silent, and that the demand for final truth must be abandoned, right? So existence does not disclose meaning. And so Nietzsche can try to replace values within the void, but in actuality, you must abandon these things in order to be happy, right? Or even be possible to happiness. But I want to sort of see like exactly kind of what he was meaning. He kind of grew out of the milieu of World War II. And you saw the rise, I don't know, of a theocracy. Yeah, why not? This sort of communist system, right, was a rule carried out officially under an officially atheistic ideology. Like it was something that was inculcated in each person. And this quote from Solzhenitsyn given at the temple address, he says that these things emerge when we have forgotten God, right? He wants to say we are witnesses to the devastation of the world, be it imposed or voluntarily undergone. The entire 20th century is being sucked into the vortex of atheism and self-destruction, right? And while I think this is I think this is true, he is trying to give a Christian response. But notice how he's describing it. He's kind of describing it the same tension that Nietzsche had said. He's describing nihilism, which is the effect from the death of God. And so he takes a risk, I think, in which he opens up the possibility to say that, well, religion is something that can be instrumental. The reason why you want to have it is that it's a cure to this nihilism. It restrains evil, it grounds morality, and it presents social order, right? And I want to say that that's not quite correct. And it's a Christian response that is influenced by this sort of death of God situation. So that was a lot. That was a lot. But I think the main conclusion is that atheism includes two parts. It includes, let's say, the negation, and then it also includes the meaning aspect to it. And then also it has these sort of broader views. It's more than just the Richard Dawkins of the world. So I'll take a couple questions. It won't be 10 minutes, it'll be 5 minutes because I do have a lot to prepare for. But if anyone has any quick questions or comments, I'd be happy to. Yes? Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. You know, the word of God is true, and we derive our morality based on the truthfulness of what it says, right? We don't make up, or, invent these sort of origin stories so that we can, like, sort of justify virtues like charity, for instance. But you kind of have to notice the problem that atheism faces, right? It's claiming that there are no values in the universe. So it's forced to do it. Otherwise, you would stop society, right? You gotta build it back up. So they do inherit the risk of what you kind of say, of evil, let's say. But that's sort of the possibility and the risk that they have to take. And there's no, and the other thing is that, they don't believe in a final judgment. So there's really no such thing as an atonement for one's sins. You just die and that's it. Right? So they have to make this move. It's a tension that they must deal with and they must answer. Right? Let's see. Anything else? I'll do you two, and then we'll have to. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. I would say yes, to that, but that's sort of the broadening that I wanted to expose. There are many atheists that would answer yes or no. There's a variety of opinions on that. There are some, like transhumanists now, that want to go beyond the sort of idea of, let's say, what is human, right? Which we're dependent on that idea, but it's something that atheism possibly can even go beyond that, right? And there are others that will critique these sorts of secular ideologies and this sort of quest for progress. So you can think of like Foucault and Derrida that will kind of move away from these quests as well. So I think truly that it is parasitic. I think truly that it does inherit these theological concepts within its own thing, and as it tries to kind of express and become independent. Well, Buddhism is a good example of something in which atheism can appear different, right? Because they accept the karmic system, whereas the atheist system does not accept the karmic system. Buddhism will be famous for rejecting, Brahman or God, right? And rejecting the self. So atheism it's not so much dependent, let's say, on the Christian foundation, but the atheism is dependent on what it is rejecting. Right? I'll go. Do we have time? We do not have time. Okay, I'm sorry. We'll talk afterwards for sure. But I do. Yes, I will. Yes, I will. I will get to that point. You got to set up the pieces, before you go attack, right? You might be saying, well, that's great and all, but you were discussing philosophers. These are philosophers. These aren't religious people. Well, really? Are you sure about that? There's a great book by Pierre Hadot, and he calls it Philosophy as a Way of Life. And I'm not reading this whole thing out. Just think of this as sort of evidence, right? This is evidence that I'm using, right? And he wants to say that in Hellenistic and Roman schools of philosophy, right, they developed a worldview, but they didn't just develop a worldview and ask you to believe it. They developed an entire way of living, right? They talk, and he's really interested in this idea that these philosophical schools asked for conversion. He said, it is a conversion which turns our entire life upside down, changing the life of the person who goes through it. It raises the individual from inauthentic condition of life, darkened by unconsciousness, harnessed by worry, to an authentic state of life. And that philosophy can become this sort of replacement for religion itself, because it asks you to examine yourself. It asks you to meditate on things. It asks you to maybe discipline your speech or to go to this sort of political sort of cause. And these philosophies of the ancient past, they did make a doctrine about reality. They did have an account for the human problem. They did exercise duties on how to overcome that problem. And they did form communities and model those patterns, right? And this picture is of Lucretius. And Lucretius was an Epicurean, right? And he wrote this book called, and back in the day, called The Nature of Things. And it is probably the closest thing to atheism you can find. Because although he doesn't necessarily reject gods, he does reject that they created the world. And he does reject that they intercede in the world. And he does state that, all that the natural causes are the reasons why, you're experiencing all the things that you're experiencing. And you have to sort of overcome your fears that you get from nature, that you get from the gods, and sort of live out life fully. And I can attest to that. I can speak to that because when I was a kid, I was really into libertarian philosophy. I remember when Ron Paul, does anyone remember Ron Paul? Well, when I was in middle school, I was the voice of Ron Paul. I tried to convince everybody that Ron Paul was right. I was reading libertarianism all over the place. I was reading like Milton Friedman and Hayek, and I would prepare to go against my liberal history teacher defend capitalism and defend freedom and defend Ronald Reagan, right? And, well, that made me very susceptible to an atheist philosophy and the philosophy of Ayn Rand. She was famous for defending capitalism. I remember reading that book, and I just was like hooked. I studied it. I remembered it. And the arguments that I used against my history teacher were from that book. And I remember she also wrote literature, like The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. And I would read those things. I would, like, in the middle of the night, and I would sit there and read the whole thing through. I was so captivated because she expressed this philosophy of individualism. She was extremely optimistic. She was something and she provided a whole comprehensive worldview. And it's interesting because you could ask, well, what was the spiritual discipline, per se, of doing that? Well, reading, meditating, and going to the Ayn Rand Institute and wanting to write an essay for their essay contest and listening to their videos, right? You know, we should take that seriously. I mean, we are Reformed Calvinists. We do read the Bible. We do meditate on God's Word. So we should take that spiritual exercise seriously. Of course, I didn't end up being a Ayn Randian. I thank God he took me out of that. But I can speak to this. I can say that in a certain sense, when I was 13 or 16 years old, I was converted to this sort of idea, right? And I want to sort of begin, right? That's sort of like a hint. I want to sort of begin making the argument from atheistic principles, right? And an atheist not only cannot ignore the tension, it cannot ignore the question of the origin of religions. How is it possible that atheism is true, and yet the vast majority of societies are all religious and believe in supernatural beings? You're going to have to provide an account for that, right? And so it doesn't, I won't go through it, but I'll give the basic idea. Wherever atheist theory of religion shows up, it is in this formula. Religion is something that masks an underlying phenomenon. It is something that is surface and symbolic, you know, the religious ideas, beliefs, but then there's an actual substratum. What is really going on, right? So one example from the atheist lawyer Feuerbach, he said that divine being is nothing else than the human being objectified, right? So we could talk about God, let's say, but what are we really doing? We're talking about a projection. And we're not really talking about God. We're talking about what we idealize, right? So, you know, or let's say with Freud, God is nothing other than an exalted father. What you're really dealing with is not God. You're dealing with, you know, your issues with your dad, right? You're dealing with these unconscious forces that conflict with you. You're dealing with a culture that, like, kind of promotes this idea of guilt. You know, so there's something that is really going on, and these sort of religious ideas are epiphenomenal. So there's two parts, right? But that poses a very big problem because in this section by an atheist named John Dewey, just imagine that he's kind of, you know, you're referencing this because he's looking at an idea. And he wants to make this division, right? He wants to separate himself from religion. But he acknowledges that there's sort of religious you know, elements that still exist, that they're still present, right? And he wants to divide religion and the religious. And he wants to say that religion is, of course, sort of an organized body of doctrines and ideas or in institutions and practices, right? But that the religious, though, the religious, is something akin to a reorientation. He says if the reorientation actually occurs, it and the sense of security and stability accompanying it are forces on their own account. It takes place in different persons in a multitude of ways. So you could say that I had a religious experience when I was looking at the mountain, and from that religious experience, I became convinced that God was real, right? But so again, back to that idea, okay, that's the surface, but then there's the real substratum, right? But you could also say that that experience is quite the same when I read a beautiful poem, and I accept the poem's, like, truth in it. and it reorients and adjusts me to this sort of situation and makes me sort of whole. And what does he want to say? The mind of man is being habituated to a new method and ideal, the road of patient cooperative inquiry operating by means of observation, experiment, record, and controlled reflection, right? So it's a new ideal. But like we said before, we were always discussing ideals when we were talking about religion. So you have like two societies, let's say. You have Islam that builds a society based on the ideals of God, and then you have Marxism that are built on sort of these ideals of Marxist ideology. Both are building ideals. Both are doing that substratum work. So the question is, do you define religion and draw the line on the surface, or do you draw the line on what is really going on the substratum? And when you do that, you kind of get this idea that atheism is doing the exact same thing that religious people are doing, right? They're adjusting themselves to reality. They're creating meaning. They're unifying the self. So, and sort of another idea that I think is pretty popular, actually I might skip this, right? I want to get back to Dennis Prudo, right? I want to get back to his idea of worship, right? Because I really think that what he does on these three definitions are just absolutely massive, right? You mentioned the onslaught of like different thinkers and different ideas of religion. That's kind of what religious studies feels like. It feels like an onslaught. It feels like a never-ending like game or quest. And when you finally come to the biblical idea of worship, it is like, oh, thank goodness, right? Because again, that first definition, he says, worship is a service of covenant renewal in which God, who redeems a people to himself and forms them into covenant and worship communities, pledges to meet with his assembled people to apply his covenant promises in their lives individually and corporately. Where does religion begin? It begins with God, and God is acting. It isn't just us going up to God. God is coming down. We're actually having a relationship with him. And it begins with him. But what is he forming? He's forming a community. He's forming a people. So there's a communal aspect to worship. And he says that true worship is the creature's act of giving honor and glory to God through Jesus Christ by the power of the Holy Spirit. The triune God is worthy of such praise, honor, and glory. So why is it that you worship? Well, first he says that religion is a whole person response. And sort of the categories that you build are things like honor, glory, fear, awe, reverence, and service. These are all components of biblical worship. And what's just so amazing is that it is this person's response plus God acting that kind of forms biblical religion. And you can sort of define false religion in such a way that it gives honor and glory and praise to that which is created, not to the Creator. So if you define religion by its object, then atheism is obviously excluded. But it's excluded not because you've examined the religion, but you've excluded it by definition. You don't even examine it at all. But when you look at, let's say, this instance in which is a diary of a Marxist, and you see, I'll read it out loud. She said, this is an account in which they're in Ravensbrück concentration camp, right? So something that is extreme suffering. And what do they say? On November 7th, 1944, between the end of work and the evening siren, a number of communists, 2 of each nationality, gathered in the Soviet prisoner of war block, among them Rosa Thalmann and Mela Ernst. The anniversary of the October Revolution was commemorated. Yevgeny Klem described the situation at the front, which was already running along the Oder, and that liberation must come soon. At the end, there was a quiet singing, "Fatherland, no enemy shall endanger you." Now, if you look at, let's say, if you define religion by its object, by God, this is clearly not religious, but if you define it by the whole person's response on honor, glory, fear, awe, reverence, Oh, it's clearly religious. Clearly. I mean, first you have the element of dividing time and commemorating time. Read the fourth commandment. Does that as well. And then you just look at, let's say, that liberation must consume. That's redemption. Right? And then it's singing praise. Fatherland, no enemy shall endanger you. Praise to what? Praise to the human collectivity that is going to bring about that redemption. You know, it's what Paul kind of says. They exchange the truth for the lie. They worship and serve the creature rather than the creator. Right? Worship is what defines religion in that sense. And why is it that we worship? Because God is worthy of our worship. He is something that so he says that worship is the human response to divine worthiness of God, ascribing honor, glory, and majesty to him, receiving and fearing him, and serving him. You know, it's really beautiful, because you could say that we have religion to go up against nihilism, and that is something that's false. You hear this stuff on like post-Christianity and other sorts of concepts that are running around that kind of keep the structure of the death of God situation intact. But that is not why we worship. We worship God because he is worthy of our praise. So it's not so much to say that atheism is meaningless. I tried to demonstrate that it is meaningful. People find happiness, even though, as the writer of Ecclesiastes says, that happiness is fleeting. People do provide meaning, even though the writer of Ecclesiastes says that it is futile. And the question really is not that, you know, atheism is meaningful. The question is whether it is true. We believe in the Bible. The Bible is true. And that is its own meaning. And we realize that truth is of more value than meaning, right? And what atheism can provide is meaning, but what it cannot provide is truth. And when you exchange the truth for the lie and worship and serve the creature rather than the creator, then you are engaging in religion. And atheism is no different than Mormonism, which is false. They don't, or Hinduism. Polytheistic is not real. They're not serving gods. They're serving the worship of their own hands. You know, it is a kind of atheism because it denies worship that God deserves. So, okay, that's my soapbox. But that's sort of the argument, and I hope that we kind of take seriously the idea that atheism has these religious components, and that it draws people away from true worship to God. So, so that's. If there's any questions or comments about that, I'd be happy to do that. If you want to kind of, I see Tyler's hand. Do you want to say something? Or? Do you mind speaking up a little bit? I can't. Yeah, I'm going to try my best to explain it. I don't know how to answer the Westminster Divine. I mean, there was a lot of other things, like they were trying to establish the Church of Scotland and all sorts of things. And I'm not really knowledgeable about that. But yes. Well, the Bible does contain an anthropology. Yeah, but what I will say is this, that you know, the atheist argument would like to say that the reason why we subscribe to something like the Westminster Confession of Faith is because we fear something, or we want something. It's a compensation, right? But that's not what we say. We say that the Word of God is true because what it says speaks truthfully, right? It's not that we go to these things to, because we fear. We act them out because we believe that they're true, right? And I think that, some of the truths of the Scripture are something that, without faith are extremely fearful. I mean, Jesus Christ died for our sins. That is something that is, he was definitely, he experienced fear. But I think that also, you have to ask the question for atheists, is what they're preaching worthy? Not if it's meaningless. Is it worth living your one life? Or is, it kind of goes back to Pascal's wager. I think that's the kind of the idea. But I don't know. I hope that I'm kind of stumbling a little bit trying to figure out how to answer. But I hope that did provide some clarity. Yeah. Yeah. Mhm. 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 Yeah, I would say so the idea, the answer that the atheist would give you is kind of the one that it says, gradually, if not always slowly, it must be climbed. If only a slow, gradual, step-by-step pathway, it can be found, right? So I admit sort of epistemic humility, but it's something that I will eventually get to, right? So it can still remain, kind of incoherent, even though he claims that it's coherent through evolution. And the other thing is that, I really want to stress that atheism does provide meaning. It does try to attempt towards coherence. But the question is it something that can guarantee? For instance, if a Marxist is claiming that there is going to be a just society at the end of history, what's the guarantee that it will be that? Well, he would like to support that it's like historical processes that eventually lead that out. So that's like the justification. But does that really solve human desires? And what happens in the middle of the way? You get to something like this and commit atrocities. How do you actually atone for that? There's no atonement. So it's not that their system or their moral system is bankrupt because it's meaningless. It's bankrupt because it's worthless. It can't save the people that suffered under this regime. It has to kind of forget it and move on, right? So, we're at 10:30, so I'll go ahead and pray. And I just thank you so much for listening. Lord, we love you so much, and help us to understand that you are worthy of praise, that our lives need to be centered around you and your word, and help us to understand how to honor you. What is your glory? How help us to inspire awe in us and meet us with our hearts today as we hear your word, and just help us to understand the truth that when we are gathered, you are in the midst, and you are changing our heart, and you are leading us to salvation, and you've provided your Son, Jesus Christ, to die on behalf of us, that we may enjoy you forever. And just help us to be more emboldened as we reach out to atheists as well, and to give them the good news of the gospel, the one cure for all false religion. In Christ's name I pray. Amen. All right. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate it.